They tried to bury the truth beneath the soil of Pennsylvania. But graves, no matter how carefully arranged, cannot keep secrets forever. Imagine walking through a cemetery at dusk, the air heavy, the ground uneven, and seeing not one, not two, but 7 identical headstones, each marked with the same surname, Veycroft, each belonging to a son who died not in battle, not in sickness, but exactly on his 21st birthday. This is not folklore. This is not some gothic tale whispered in a novel. This is history sealed away in dusty archives and whispered only in taverns, where old men lower their voices when the name Veycroft is spoken. And tonight, you will hear what you were never meant to hear. Before I take you further into this forbidden story, I need you to do something. Like this video, share it with someone who hungers for hidden truths, and subscribe to DeadScroll right now. You don't want to miss what we uncover here, because once you step into this labyrinth, there is no way back. And tell me in the comments below, where are you watching this from? I want to know. City, state, or country? Drop it below, and let's see where this dark circle of knowledge reaches. The story of the Veycroft family is not simply about death. It is about design. A pattern too precise to be accident, too cruel to be coincidence. Their sons, each vibrant with life, each carrying the future of their bloodline, struck down like clockwork at the very threshold of manhood. And the deeper you look, the more you realize this was no curse of superstition, but something orchestrated, calculated, and tied to powers far beyond their control. The Veycrofts were not poor laborers, not faceless miners, not forgotten immigrants. They were selected, chosen by invisible hands, bound by agreements no man should ever sign, and trapped in a legacy that required blood as its payment. Their story is not just about the 7 graves that remain. It is about the silence that surrounds them. And silence, when repeated generation after generation, begins to look less like coincidence and more like obedience. But why 21? Why always the same age, the same moment when youth transforms into adulthood? That question haunted historians, priests, and even scientists who dared to examine the Veycroft records. The answer lies buried in a system so dark, so carefully engineered, that once you see it, you'll never look at your own family history the same way again. The first son's death began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the year 1849. But what followed would stain the Veycroft name for eternity. The year was 1849. America was still young, raw, and bleeding, its towns expanding like veins across the wilderness. In the coal-choked valleys of western Pennsylvania, the Veycroft family had carved out a reputation of quiet dignity. They were not wealthy aristocrats, nor destitute laborers. They lived in that fragile middle ground, respected but never entirely trusted. The eldest son, Alaric Veycroft, was to inherit the family's modest holdings, a timber yard and a tract of fertile land along the river. At 21, he stood on the threshold of a promising future. He was engaged to marry, and already he spoke like a man eager to lead, his voice carrying a confidence that unsettled those who preferred families like his to remain silent, obedient, and indebted. On the morning of his birthday, the town awoke to a disturbing silence. Alaric had been seen the night before at a gathering in the parish hall, healthy, laughing, alive. By dawn, his body was discovered seated at the edge of the Veycroft estate, upright, as if waiting for someone. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, no evidence of poison. His eyes, wide open, were fixed on the rising sun. His pocket watch, a gift from his father, had stopped at exactly midnight. The coroner's report, preserved in brittle ink, described his death as cessation of vital force without evident cause. Locals called it the Veycroft curse. Priests called it divine judgment. But behind closed doors, whispers spread of something else entirely, a payment. Because Alaric's death was not the only strange occurrence that day. In the ledgers of the Keystone Coal and Iron Company, the same industrial empire that would later control Millfield, an unusual notation appeared. Accounts settled. Veycroft won. No explanation. No context. Just a chilling suggestion that the life of a son was currency in some hidden transaction. His father, Elias Veycroft, collapsed into despair, but his mother, Catherine, refused to believe it was coincidence. She claimed to hear footsteps outside her window every night afterward, pacing in the gravel, pausing beneath the nursery room where her younger son slept. She swore she could hear a voice whispering, over and over, "One is taken, the rest must follow." That phrase became the echo of the Veycroft household, a reminder that Alaric's death was not an ending, but a beginning. 5 years later, another 21st birthday would arrive. Another son, another debt coming due. By 1854, the Veycroft estate had grown quieter. The laughter of Alaric was gone, and in its place, silence hung like a shroud. His younger brother, Nathaniel Veycroft, had inherited both the shadow of grief and the weight of expectation. Nathaniel was different from Alaric, leaner, sharper, with a restless energy that often drew suspicion from neighbors. Where Alaric had been steady and ambitious, Nathaniel was inquisitive, forever scratching at the edges of mystery. On the eve of his 21st birthday, he confided to a close friend that he did not expect to see another dawn. "The clock is not mine," he whispered. "It belongs to something else, something counting down." Those words unsettled the friend so deeply that he later recorded them in a sworn statement, archived but hidden for decades. The morning of March 3rd came heavy with rain. Nathaniel insisted on working alone in the family's timber yard, despite his mother's pleas. Witnesses later testified they heard him singing, a hymn no one recognized, moments before the crash of splintering would split the valley. They found him crushed beneath a massive oak that had fallen in a way no natural wind could explain. The tree's trunk bore marks as if cut deliberately, though no axe was ever found. His watch, like Alaric's, was stopped at midnight. But it was not the manner of his death that most terrified the family. It was what they found in his room. Folded neatly beneath his pillow was a letter addressed not to his parents, not to his fiancée, but to the company. Second rendered. The debt continues. The handwriting was Nathaniel's, but the tone was cold, detached, almost ritualistic. His mother swore he had been in her sight the entire evening before, never once leaving to write such a note. And yet, there it was, ink fresh, signature undeniable. The burial was swift, the priest's words clipped, the neighbors uneasy. And once again, in the company ledgers, a notation appeared, Veycroft, too. By now, the whispers in town had grown into fearful certainty. The Veycrofts were marked, not by God, not by chance, but by a system of exchange older and darker than anyone dared to name aloud. And as Elias Veycroft lowered his second son into the ground, he began to suspect what his wife already feared. The family was no longer free. The third son, Edward, was approaching manhood, and his 21st year was already waiting. What history books will never admit is that communities like Blackthorn were not isolated tragedies. They were carefully monitored experiments, small enough to be hidden, yet significant enough to provide data. Think about it. 47 children, chained, starved, tested, and brutalized. Not by chance, not by one deranged family, but by design. Who fed the Blackthorns their resources? Who ensured that no law enforcement intervened? The Blackthorn name was whispered in church pews, in courthouse halls, in the very offices of men who were supposed to protect the people. Their crimes were not hidden from power. They were enabled by it. This was not about one family's cruelty. This was about control and about silencing the weak while elevating the strong. Every scream from that basement was a data point. Every child was a subject in an experiment masked as punishment. And the worst part? The Blackthorns weren't alone. Across the United States in the 19th century, hidden basements, sealed convents, and forgotten asylums became cages where silence reigned and records vanished. But Ravenshade's secret was different. The Blackthorn family's basement wasn't just an isolated dungeon. It was a hub, a testing ground, a place where psychological and physical torment merged into one grand study of fear. And if 47 children were chained there, how many others across the country were? How many basements like this existed, ignored by society, erased from newspapers, dismissed as rumor. That is what makes this story more than horror. It is evidence. Evidence that power thrives in silence, and silence is not natural. It is engineered. The townsfolk of Ravenshade knew. Do not be deceived into thinking the Blackthorns operated in complete secrecy. The truth is far darker. People chose not to see. Farmers who lived nearby spoke of hearing strange noises at night, the cries of children that carried across the moors. A blacksmith recalled seeing wagons arrive at the Blackthorn estate under the cover of stormy nights, covered with canvas, as though they carried cargo too shameful for daylight. A schoolteacher once counted more children in the Blackthorn yard than the family claimed as their own, only to fall silent after being summoned to the manor. These whispers never made it to official records. Why? Because the very machinery of authority, the sheriff, the priests, the local council, was entangled with the Blackthorn name. The family's wealth was ancient, tied to land and old agreements carved in stone. Every warning was silenced, every suspicion dismissed as hysteria. The Blackthorns hosted Sunday services, sat in the front pews, donated to the parish, and then returned to their cellar where 47 children lived chained to walls. This is the essence of horror. When evil does not hide in shadows, but wears the mask of respectability, when an entire community participates through silence. Ask yourself, how many Ravenshades exist in history? How many times have the screams of the innocent been drowned beneath hymns, legal oaths, and polite conversation? The Blackthorn case forces us to confront a truth few dare acknowledge. Sometimes, the greatest horrors are not committed in darkness, but under the gaze of a world that refuses to act. The Blackthorn Manor itself was a fortress of contradictions. From a distance, it looked like prosperity carved into stone. Tall chimneys, sprawling gardens, the grand facade that whispered of wealth and stability. Yet those who came closer spoke of an unnatural stillness. The birds never perched on its roof. The wind carried a strange metallic scent from the direction of its cellars. Windows were covered with heavy drapes, even in the brightest hours of noon, as if the family feared what might be revealed if sunlight touched their secrets. Visitors often remarked on the silence inside, the kind of silence that feels manufactured, as though something is listening just beyond the walls. Servants rotated constantly, never staying longer than a season, their departures shrouded in vague excuses. And beneath the floors, carved into the bedrock itself, lay the basement where the children were chained. The walls were damp, etched with scratches that did not belong to time, but to fingernails. Chains clinked with every slight movement, a grim symphony of suffering that would echo endlessly in the darkness. When one child's cries grew too loud, they were silenced, not with comfort, but with punishment. It was not chaos down there. It was order, discipline, and control designed with chilling precision. The Blackthorns were not reckless sadists. They were systematic architects of despair. And it is that cold calculation, not the brutality itself, that makes their legacy so deeply horrifying. This was not madness. This was method. What makes the Blackthorn case so disturbing is not only the horror itself, but the questions it raises about power and silence. 47 children did not simply vanish from the world without someone noticing. Neighbors, clergy, physicians, someone must have seen, must have suspected. Yet no one acted. In Ravenshade, whispers were common, but action was rare. The Blackthorn's wealth ensured that suspicion dissolved into silence. Those who lived nearby spoke later of strange sounds carried on the night air. The rhythmic clanking of iron, muffled sobs, and at times, what sounded like chanting. But the Blackthorn family entertained guests, made charitable donations, and maintained their influence with local officials. In a world where reputation was more powerful than evidence, their status acted as a shield. And so the cries of children were dismissed as imagination, or worse, as inconvenient truths that polite society agreed not to hear. In the rare moments when outsiders were summoned into the house, they were restricted to certain rooms, carefully staged with fine furniture, warm firelight, and music. Beyond those walls, the children remained shackled in the dark, unseen and unheard. This was the genius of the Blackthorn facade, to convince the world that nothing was wrong, while maintaining an empire of torment beneath their very feet. And in that deception lies a chilling truth. The greatest horrors are not hidden in caves or forests, but behind locked doors in the very heart of civilization. The Blackthorn home itself seemed to play a role in the nightmare. Built of dark stone and towering like a fortress on the edge of Ravenshade, its architecture was both imposing and suffocating. The house was designed with layers of secrecy, false walls, hidden stairways, and locked passageways known only to the family. Many of these concealed spaces led downward, always downward, until one reached the cellar vaults, where the air was thick, damp, and reeking of rusted iron. It was there that investigators would later find the chains. Rows of them, bolted into the stone floor, their ends worn from desperate struggling. The walls bore scratches, sometimes deep enough to peel away the mortar, made by small hands trying to escape. Lantern soot stained the ceilings, proof of dim lights kept burning at irregular hours. But most chilling were the etchings, words, symbols, names carved into the stone, likely by the children themselves in moments of fading hope. No one could decipher all of them, though some appeared to be prayers, others curses. The Blackthorns had crafted a labyrinth beneath their home, not only as a prison, but as a system of control, a structure that mirrored their twisted philosophy. The higher one rose in their house, the more opulence and light, but the deeper one went, the more suffering and darkness. This was not accidental. It was architectural theology, an inverted cathedral, with a basement served as their altar of cruelty. When word first spread that 47 children had been discovered in the Blackthorn basement, chained and half-starved, the townsfolk of Ravenshade refused to believe it. Denial was easier than acceptance. The Blackthorn family had been pillars of wealth, patrons of the church, and hosts of grand gatherings. To accuse them of such barbarity was to accuse the very foundation of Ravenshade's pride. Yet, as the evidence emerged, denial gave way to horror. The constables who descended into the vaults described the scene in broken voices. Children, some no older than 4, others already in their teens, sat hunched against the walls, their limbs thin as sticks, their eyes hollow, reflecting only fear. They flinched at the presence of light, as though it burned them, their skin pale from years in the subterranean dark. Some clutched one another, others sat alone, rocking silently, their minds fractured beyond repair. The air reeked of mildew, rot, and human suffering. Shackles clinked with every small movement, the sound of hopelessness echoing against the cold stone. But the most disturbing detail, whispered by the constables long after, was that not all the children appeared desperate to escape. Some sat motionless, gazing with eerie calm, as if the chains were no longer punishment but identity, born in a bondage so long that freedom itself was alien. The question that haunted Ravenshade most was simple. Where had these children come from? The Blackthorns were not known to have so many heirs, nor had the births of dozens of children ever been recorded. Parish registers were combed, midwives questioned, neighbors interrogated. But the answers were incomplete, inconsistent, and terrifyingly vague. Some claimed the Blackthorns purchased children from traveling merchants. Others whispered of orphans lured in with promises of food, while a few dared to suggest the family bred them in secret, concealing pregnancies, silencing cries, and keeping the offspring beneath the earth from the moment of birth. The horror of that thought alone was enough to fracture the sanity of those who investigated. To imagine an entire generation raised below the soil, chained before they could walk, conditioned never to know the sun. It painted the Blackthorn estate not as a home, but as a farm. A farm for what? None dared say aloud. Some children bore strange scars on their bodies, cuts that seemed deliberate, as though experiments had been carried out. Others had teeth worn down unnaturally, their nails torn, as if they had been forced into unnatural labor. Every detail pointed not to neglect, but to a system, an intentional and cruel order. And behind that system loomed the cold, calculating hand of the Blackthorn family. The Blackthorn name had always carried with it an air of foreboding. For generations, whispers followed them, of hidden dealings, occult gatherings, and a bloodline that dabbled in forces better left untouched. But until the discovery of the chained children, such rumors had lived in the shadows of taverns and midnight gossip. Now, they clawed their way into daylight with dreadful weight. Villagers recalled strange noises drifting from the estate on stormy nights. The rattling of chains, the low hum of chanting, the unnatural cries of children that no one dared investigate. And yet, the family remained untouchable. Their wealth was vast, their ties to clergy and magistrates unshakable. When the bodies of the children were first pulled from the basement, there were calls for immediate justice. But those voices quickly softened into silence, smothered by bribes, threats, and the heavy hand of influence. Records vanished, testimonies were retracted, and the official story became a twisted fiction. That the children had been discovered too late, that their origins could not be traced, and that the matter was best left buried with them. Ravenshade understood, then, that it was not only the Blackthorns who were guilty, but the very system that protected them. In shielding the family, the town itself became an accomplice. The townspeople who lived closest to the Blackthorn estate spoke in hushed voices of the nights after the discovery. They said that strange lights still glimmered in the windows, as if someone, or something, remained within the decaying halls, carrying on the rituals that had once kept children bound in chains. The magistrates assured Ravenshade that the mansion had been emptied, sealed, and abandoned. But locals swore they heard movement inside, the dragging of chains across stone floors, and cries that did not belong to the living. Fear gripped the town, yet no one dared approach the estate, for everyone remembered how quickly those who asked questions disappeared or fell silent. The children's graves, hastily marked and poorly kept, became overgrown, as if the earth itself sought to hide the evidence. The few who tried to tend to them reported a suffocating heaviness in the air, a pressure that made their lungs ache and their hearts falter. It was as though the spirits of the children had never been released, their torment tethering them to the soil of Ravenshade. The Blackthorn name may have been dragged through whispers of horror, but no true justice had been dealt. And in that failure, the darkness remained unbroken, its roots pushing deeper into the bones of the land itself. By the winter of 1872, a strange transformation had overtaken Ravenshade. Families who once prided themselves on honor and faith began locking their doors earlier, extinguishing lamps before nightfall, and keeping their children close. Fear had altered the rhythm of daily life, as though the town had inherited the curse of the Blackthorns themselves. Yet there was another, darker shift, an undercurrent of silence. People stopped speaking the children's names. The mass grave was avoided, its soil left untended, covered in weeds and frost. It was as if the town collectively decided that forgetting was safer than remembering. But forgetting came at a cost. The few who tried to speak openly, teachers, clergymen, even mothers of the missing, found themselves shunned, cast out, or in some cases, vanishing altogether. It became clear to many that Ravenshade was not only haunted by the chains of the dead children, but controlled by an unseen hand that demanded silence. The Blackthorn family may have been exposed, but the institution that protected them still moved through the shadows. It fed on silence, on fear, and on the cowardice of a town that would rather hide its wounds than face its sins. And so the children remained unheard, their cries trapped between earth and memory. But silence never lasts forever. By early 1873, travelers passing through Ravenshade began to report strange encounters near the abandoned Blackthorn estate. Riders claimed they heard the clatter of chains across the snow, even when no one was there. A farmer swore he saw the outlines of small figures moving at dawn, their pale shapes flickering between the trees before vanishing into the mist. Others described hearing children's voices, faint and hollow, calling for help. These accounts spread beyond the town, drawing journalists, investigators, and opportunists who sought to turn tragedy into spectacle. Yet, curiously, many of those who attempted to document the Blackthorn estate disappeared themselves. Diaries, sketches, and testimony were often found half-finished, abruptly ending mid-sentence as though the hand that wrote them had been pulled away. Ravenshade's leaders quickly discouraged outsiders, claiming the land was cursed, dangerous, and best left undisturbed. But in hushed tones, locals admitted something worse: the belief that the spirits of the chained children had not found peace. Instead, they lingered, waiting for acknowledgement, for justice, for the truth to be spoken. Their restless energy had fused with the soil, creating a presence that no prayer could dispel. The whispers about the chained children began to evolve into a dark local legend. Parents in Ravenshade would warn their children not to wander too close to the Blackthorn estate, insisting that if they lingered near the property after sundown, the spirits of the lost ones would call them into the ruins and chain them as well. Some even claimed the Blackthorn family themselves had been cursed, that the bloodline was forever marked by the sins committed in that cellar. Priests sent from neighboring towns attempted to bless the grounds, but many fled before completing their rites, unnerved by the overwhelming sense of suffocation they described. They claimed the air inside the Blackthorn house pressed against the lungs, heavy and unyielding, as if something unseen was feeding on their fear. Travelers who camped nearby reported waking in the night with bruises around their wrists and ankles, though no ropes or chains had bound them. Others swore that when they awoke, they heard the faint echo of children weeping just outside their tents, yet found no one when they searched. By this time, the tale of the Blackthorn cellar was no longer considered rumor. It was spoken of as a warning, a living curse etched into the very fabric of Ravenshead. By the 1890s, the Blackthorn property had become a destination for those who sought forbidden truths. Scholars of the occult, wanderers who dabbled in seances, and even self-proclaimed scientists arrived, hoping to uncover the secret of the chained children. One journal entry recovered from that period describes the cellar as an abyss of time where suffering refuses to die. Inside, the iron shackles remained embedded in the stone, some still stained with what looked like rust or blood. The deeper investigators went, the more they reported strange sensations. The sound of rattling metal though no one moved, the heavy rhythm of breathing though the cellar was empty, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched from the corners where shadows clung unnaturally thick. Several researchers abandoned their studies, swearing never to return. A few stayed, but those who did began to unravel. Their writings shifted from academic analysis into ramblings about children who never aged and the black roots of the family tree twisting beneath the soil. What began as an investigation into a crime had transformed into a descent into something much older, much darker, something Ravenshade was never meant to awaken. It was around this time that whispers of the Blackthorn name returned to Ravenshade, like a curse that could never be erased. Families who had long since changed their surnames or fled the region began to receive anonymous letters. Letters with no sender, only a wax seal depicting a blackthorn branch coiled like a serpent. Inside were warnings written in shaky, uneven script. The children are waiting. The chains are not broken. The roots will claim you. Panic spread like wildfire among the descendants. Some abandoned their homes overnight, leaving food still on the table, while others attempted to burn the letters, only to find them inexplicably reappear days later on their doorsteps. Clergymen called for fasting and prayer, declaring that the sins of the Blackthorn family had awakened something demonic. But ordinary townsfolk had a simpler explanation. The Blackthorn curse was alive and hunting its own bloodline. And in Ravenshade, it was common knowledge that those who tried to ignore it never lasted long. Their bodies were either found twisted in the forest, faces locked in terror, or never found at all. By 1882, the Blackthorn story had evolved from whispered superstition to a full-blown obsession that gripped Ravenshade in terror. Farmers refused to till soil near the family's abandoned estate, claiming the ground itself was tainted and drank more blood than water. Travelers avoided the roads that passed the Blackthorn property, even if it meant taking miles of detours through swampland. The sheriff of Ravenshade attempted to dismiss the rumors, but his own deputy resigned after claiming to see children's shadows darting across the path near the ruins. Those who were brave or foolish enough to enter the basement of the estate returned broken, muttering incoherently about chains that rattled in the darkness and whispers calling them by name. And yet, every time the authorities tried to board up or demolish the remnants of the house, accidents followed. Workers fell from scaffolds, saw blades snapped without cause, and fires mysteriously erupted. It seemed as if the house itself rejected interference, as though the Blackthorn legacy had been built into its very foundation. By the late 1880s, scholars and physicians from beyond Ravenshade began arriving, lured by the rumors of the Blackthorn family's unexplainable condition. Some came with notebooks, others with surgical tools, eager to dissect the mystery as if it were nothing more than a medical anomaly. But what they encountered was something far beyond their expertise. The journals they left behind, many of which were confiscated or destroyed by local authorities, described skeletal deformities that shifted even after death, tissue that resisted decay, and voices that seemed to resonate from empty rooms. One physician, Dr. Emil Harrington, vanished during his third expedition into the estate. His colleagues claimed he had been pulled into the earth itself, his lantern swallowed in a blink. After that, official study ceased, leaving only a handful of scattered notes and fragments of research. The Blackthorn family story was no longer a matter of science. It had become a case of fear, superstition, and power, one that no authority dared to challenge. The silence surrounding the Blackthorn estate grew heavier with each passing year. Villagers avoided the woods entirely, refusing to even speak the family's name aloud. Farmers swore that crops near the borders of Ravenshade withered faster, as though the soil itself absorbed the corruption from the mansion's grounds. By 1890, the estate had become more than an abandoned house. It was a boundary between the natural and the unnatural. Some whispered that the Blackthorns had achieved a twisted form of survival, existing not as flesh and blood, but as echoes that haunted the air itself. Travelers who dared to cross the property line often spoke of hands brushing against their shoulders, shadows keeping pace beside them, or the faint sound of children crying underground. These were not drunken tales spun in taverns. These were confessions, often whispered by men who refused to return to the woods again. The Blackthorn legacy was not merely a memory. It was a curse that lingered, feeding on the fear of those who remembered by the dawn of the new century. Ravenshade itself was shrinking. Families moved away, merchants closed their shops, and the once bustling village became a husk of silence. The Blackthorn curse was not confined to their mansion. It radiated outward, poisoning everything in its reach. Survivors of the town often told chilling accounts. Livestock born twisted, wells that turned black overnight, and infants who never cried after birth. It was as if the land itself had been claimed by something deeper, something older than the Blackthorns themselves. Some claimed it was their bloodline, cursed long before the 47 children were ever shackled in that basement. Others swore it was the house, that it had absorbed every scream, every ounce of suffering, until it became a living organism, pulsing with malevolence. Whether it was blood or brick, one truth remained unshakable. Ravenshade was not a town abandoned by chance. It was devoured by the shadow of the Blackthorn family. The mansion, left to rot after the last of the Blackthorn heirs perished, became a place of pilgrimage for the daring and the damned. Wanderers, occultists, and thrill-seekers crossed the overgrown path leading to its gates, each lured by rumors of the cries that still echoed beneath the floorboards. Few returned. Those who did emerged pale, trembling, their words fractured and feverish. One man claimed he saw the shadows of children moving along the walls, shackles dragging across the stone, though no figures were there to cast them. Another swore he had heard a woman humming, her voice melodic, almost soothing, until he realized it came from beneath the dirt of the garden. The Blackthorn house was no longer a ruin. It had become a monument to agony, a cathedral of suffering, drawing in those who thought themselves immune to fear, only to prove them wrong. Legends often grow from whispers, but with the Blackthorn mansion, the whispers became screams. By the late 19th century, newspapers cautiously began reporting sightings and disappearances tied to the estate. A string of hunters had entered the grounds, chasing the promise of abandoned wealth hidden in the rotting walls. None returned. Weeks later, their horses were found wandering the nearby woods, saddles torn, reins shredded as though gnawed by teeth, not of animals, but of men. Locals swore that within those halls, the spirits of the chained children still lingered, shackled not only to stone, but to the very memory of their suffering. Even priests summoned to cleanse the grounds left pale and broken, their faith seemingly undone. One was found wandering aimlessly in the nearby fields, muttering in Latin about a door that could not be closed, a door that should never have been opened. But what truly cemented the mansion's place in forbidden history was the discovery of journals, believed to be penned by the Blackthorn patriarch himself. Unearthed by a wandering drifter who dared breach the cellar, the writings spoke of experiments, rituals carried out under the guise of science, blending alchemy, medicine, and something older, darker. He wrote not of children as offspring, but as vessels, tools for unlocking power beyond human grasp. The journals spoke of a choir beneath the earth, where the screams of the children created resonance, a vibration he believed could open thresholds to other realms. That drifter, too, vanished not long after turning the journals over to a parish in Briarhelm. Days later, the church caught fire in the night, the journals lost forever in the flames. Authorities claimed it was an accident. Locals whispered it was the Blackthorn curse, silencing those who dared keep records of its truths. The mansion became more than a ruin. It was forbidden ground. Parents warned their children never to stray near. Farmers swore their crops died when the wind blew from its direction. Yet for every soul that feared it, there were others who hungered for it. Men with power, knowledge, and desperation traveled in secret, seeking what the Blackthorn family had uncovered. For they knew the truth that common folk only feared. Some doors, once opened, never close. The legend of the Blackthorn basement no longer belonged to the family or the land. It belonged to the people, etched into whispered warnings that mothers gave their children when the night grew too quiet. But what most do not realize is that the records surrounding those 47 children remain locked in archives, marked with seals of government confidentiality, as though the state itself conspired to bury the truth. Officially, they were wards of the parish, nameless, forgotten souls swept into the custody of a family wealthy enough to ensure no questions were asked. Yet the few scraps of documents that leaked into public view suggest something more deliberate. Entire orphanages emptied overnight, rural parishes reporting lost children, and clergy transferring custody to the Blackthorn estate. The paper trail reads not as a tragedy of neglect, but as a transaction, a system feeding the mansion with flesh and innocence. Why? That question still burns. Survivors' descendants speak of inherited scars, nightmares passed down like cursed heirlooms. Generations later, children born into those bloodlines would wake in the night screaming about stone walls, cold chains, and voices whispering from beneath the ground. Some claim to see figures standing in doorways, pale, hollow-eyed children who vanished when spoken to. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as hysteria, but how can hysteria carve claw marks into doors, or leave the smell of damp earth lingering in rooms never opened? The Blackthorn house, long abandoned, still breathes with the weight of its secrets, and the chains, though rusted, still carry the memory of every wrist that struggled against them. The truth is simple, and it is terrifying. Someone wanted those children hidden, silenced, and erased. And the Blackthorn family was either complicit or enslaved by a force greater than themselves. If the walls of the Blackthorn basement could speak, they would not tell us of innocence, but of a system older than the family itself. For centuries, Powerful households were entrusted with custodial care of the unwanted. The orphan, the bastard, the poor soul society wished to erase. But in Blackthorn's case, there was something ritualistic in the way the records were handled, the silence enforced, and the secrecy maintained. Some scholars argue that the children were not simply abandoned, but selected. Selection implies intent. It implies criteria. And if that is true, then we must ask the most damning question of all. Who was doing the selecting, and for what purpose? When investigators decades later uncovered fragments of journals belonging to Elias Blackthorn, they expected accounts of farming, trade, or household affairs. What they discovered instead were coded entries, cryptic notes referencing the gathering, the chosen, and the binding of innocence to shadow. No explicit confession was written, but the language suggested something darker than mere neglect. Elias described children as resources and living vessels, words that carried no compassion, only utility. Some believe these journals point toward ritualistic practices, rites meant to bind the estate with power beyond comprehension. And if so, those 47 children were not merely victims. They were sacrifices in a game no child was meant to play. Yet skeptics argue another angle, that the Blackthorns were pawns, not masters, that the state, the church, or a hidden order funneled the children into the house for experiments no official dared record. Whispered theories connect the event to early studies in psychological conditioning, manipulation of human will, and attempts to create obedience through suffering. If true, then the Blackthorn family basement was not a tomb. It was a laboratory, and the screams of children were not accidents of cruelty, but data points in a monstrous experiment. Whether one believes the Blackthorns were cultists or coerced participants in a larger agenda, the conclusion remains chillingly the same. Those children were never meant to walk free. Their chains were not random. Their silence was engineered. And every locked archive, every sealed report, every missing document screams louder than the truth itself. The tragedy of the Blackthorn basement lies not only in what was done, but in how thoroughly it was hidden. A crime of passion leaves blood, fingerprints, and rash confessions. But this was an architecture of silence. Each child's name was erased from registries. No birth certificates, no school enrollments, no church records, as though they had been swallowed by the ground before they could ever leave a trace in the world above. Witness accounts are equally scarce, and those that survive are unreliable, clouded by fear. A farmer once reported seeing a line of children in gray rags being led through the woods by lantern light. Another villager recalled hearing a chorus of cries drifting across the fields at night, though no child was ever seen in the village by day. The pattern was unmistakable. People noticed, whispered, and then fell silent, as if a weight pressed down on the entire community, warning them against curiosity. This silence was not natural. It was engineered. Investigators later found evidence of payments, small but consistent sums, funneled to certain townsfolk. Some believe these were bribes, hush money to keep locals from raising alarm. Others claim the payments were compensation for complicity, that villagers acted as watchmen, ensuring no child escaped the estate's boundaries. If so, the Blackthorn horror wasn't contained within one family. It was a system of shadows, rooted in community and bound by collective fear. But silence cannot last forever. Rumors of the basement children began leaking into nearby towns, carried by travelers and tradesmen. By the time word reached regional authorities, decades had passed. The children were long gone or buried. Still, when officials confronted the remaining Blackthorn heirs, their answers were as hollow as the family estate itself. They denied, deflected, and destroyed what little evidence survived. Records of court proceedings show sudden interruptions, files sealed under the excuse of national interest, and entire transcripts missing from archives. It was as if the government itself feared what lay beneath the estate. The true horror is this: no one was punished. Not a single Blackthorn heir was convicted. No villager was held accountable. The church issued no statement. The state washed its hands. And yet, 47 children remained unaccounted for, except for the rusted chains, the decayed restraints, and the cold, stone walls that still whisper of their torment. Silence can sometimes be more terrifying than screams. And in the ruins of Ravenshade, silence has a way of pressing itself against your chest like a weight that refuses to let you breathe. The deeper investigators went, the less sound seemed to exist. No wind, no birds, no echo of their own voices. One officer described it as walking into a mouth that swallowed even the sound of footsteps. That silence wasn't natural, it was engineered. The Blackthorn family, for generations, had understood something about power. True control doesn't come from what you give people, it comes from what you take away. Noise, light, comfort. Strip those away, and the human spirit fractures. Inside the hidden basement, chains rattled but faintly. Children were kept in near darkness for days, weeks, sometimes months. No cries for help would ever carry through the layered walls. No one in town could hear them, even when their throats went raw from begging. And here lies the horror that chills even hardened men. The chains in that basement were not new when they were found. They bore marks, deep scratches that layered over one another, years apart. Whoever had been there before had tried to escape, had fought, had screamed into the dark. And still nothing. Ravenshade's soil had been swallowing sound for decades, perhaps centuries. Was this the design of the Blackthorn family? Or was Ravenshade itself complicit? Survivors' accounts, few though they were, spoke of a silence that was alive. They swore they could hear breathing in the walls, even when no one else was there. They claimed voices would whisper only inside their skulls, bypassing their ears. Doctors would later dismiss these stories as trauma-induced hallucinations. But dismissing fear does not erase its cause. Imagine a child in that silence. No sense of time, no sense of day or night. Their only markers of existence the gnawing of hunger and the cold iron around their wrists. That silence didn't just cage their bodies, it caged their minds. It bred despair so profound that some gave up struggling altogether. They lay still, waiting to become another nameless shadow in Ravenshade's basement. And yet, some survived. A handful crawled out of that silence, broken but breathing. But what they carried with them was far worse than chains. The testimony of the few who escaped Blackthorn's clutches is perhaps the most damning evidence of all. In hushed voices, with trembling hands, they spoke of rituals carried out in the dead of night. One survivor, whose words were preserved in an 1880s journal, described how the family gathered in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse, torches burning with a strange greenish flame. A circle was drawn on the dirt floor, and within it, the children of the household were forced to chant words they did not understand, syllables that seemed to claw at the mind, twisting thought and bending memory. The Blackthorns would lead these ceremonies with a precision that bordered on military discipline. Each movement was deliberate, rehearsed, perfected over decades. But what unsettled the witnesses most wasn't the structure of the rituals, it was what followed. After hours of chanting, when exhaustion began to break the youngest voices, the Blackthorn matriarch would step forward with a wooden box, lined with symbols scorched into its surface. From within, she would draw objects that no one could later describe with certainty. Survivors said their eyes could not hold the image, that their memory recoiled, leaving only a sensation of sickness and dread. It was in these moments that the children chained in the basement, hidden from the outside world, would be brought forward. They were not participants, they were sacrifices. Accounts described the family murmuring about binding the bloodline, about feeding something that had lived beneath Ravenshade long before the farmhouse was built. The children's cries, muffled and desperate, became part of the ritual soundscape, woven into the Blackthorn's chants until silence fell and the cellar reeked of iron and decay. No local priest dared interfere, though whispers suggest they knew. One parish record even contains a marginal note. There are things in that house that God himself refuses to look upon. This single line, hidden between accounts of births and baptisms, carries the weight of an unspoken horror. a recognition that what thrived in the blackthorn cellar was not just corruption of the flesh, but a spiritual rot that had taken root in Ravenshade itself. And yet, the Blackthorns continued to live openly, their farms still producing, their lineage still intact. No authority, no church, no law had the courage to act. The town turned away, complicit in its silence, while the rituals deepened and the chains below the farmhouse grew tighter. The trial of Elias Ranmore was unlike anything the courts of Ravenshade, or anywhere else in the country, had ever seen. Newspapers described it as a proceeding balanced between sanity and nightmare, for the very presence of the boy in the courtroom seemed to bend the atmosphere into something oppressive. Witnesses later claimed that when Elias was brought in, shackled and pale, the air grew heavy, the chandeliers flickered, and a silence unlike any other descended upon the crowd. Some fainted before testimony even began. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimonies of villagers, priests, and former doctors who had witnessed Elias's unexplainable feats. They spoke of the night fires in the woods that extinguished themselves the moment he appeared, of animals lying dead at his feet with no wound upon them, of children who claimed he whispered to them in dreams long before meeting them. Each story painted a picture not of a criminal, but of something that simply could not be human. Yet the court demanded to categorize him, to force the unnameable into a legal framework. The defense, for its part, argued insanity, though even they struggled to define it. If Elias was truly mad, they reasoned, then he was a victim of circumstance, a boy born in his shadows, not of his own making. They presented medical reports showing his body healed faster than natural, his blood resisting coagulation in ways physicians couldn't replicate. The doctors who once sought to study him now avoided even entering the room when he was present. But it was Elias himself who unsettled the courtroom the most. When asked to speak, he answered in measured, almost poetic sentences, always calm, never defensive. He said little of the crimes he was accused of, ritualistic killings, disappearances, and desecrations of sacred ground, but he did not deny them either. Instead, he spoke of destiny, of a cycle that had existed long before Ravenshade, long before man had written law. He spoke of his role not as a murderer, but as a continuance of something that must unfold. The jury was divided between fear and disbelief. Some wanted him executed immediately, claiming no prison could contain him. Others whispered that killing him might unleash something far worse. The judge, an old man who had seen decades of crime and corruption, appeared visibly shaken during the proceedings. At one point, when Elias turned his eyes toward him, he dropped his gavel, his hand trembling uncontrollably. The verdict would take days to form, and even then, it would be questioned for centuries. But in those hours within the courthouse, Ravenshade learned that a trial was not merely about justice. It was about staring into the abyss and daring to name it. The courtroom was silent, eerily silent, when the surviving witnesses were finally called. Men who had worked the lands of Briarfield, women who had once been welcomed by the sisters Belladas into the inn, and even a child now grown into adulthood, trembling as he recalled what he had seen from beneath the floorboards. Each testimony painted a picture so disturbing, so grotesque, that it seemed to defy belief. But disbelief had no place here. The graves were real, the names etched into forgotten soil, and the horror undeniable. The prosecution outlined a pattern. Each disappearance had been cloaked in kindness. A weary traveler, a widowed farmer, a grieving mother, all found comfort in the sisters' words, food, and shelter. Then came the nights of singing, the strange hymns that seemed more incantation than prayer, followed by silence, followed by absence. Their bodies were never returned to their families. They were claimed by the soil beneath Briarfield. One testimony in particular shook the hall to its foundations. A man named Halbert Crow, who had been 17 when he escaped, recounted the smell. Not the scent of decay alone, but the pungent mixture of herbs, incense, and burned fat that had clung to his clothing long after he had fled. He swore that the sisters believed their rituals kept them young, that every burial beneath the inn was not merely disposal, but an offering. They prayed, Crow whispered, but not to God. The defense had little to offer. They claimed the sisters were misunderstood, that rural gossip had woven myth from tragedy, and that the inn had simply been a place where lonely people came to die. But the graves told otherwise. And with every name, every testimony, every horrifying recollection, the mask of sanctity fell apart. Yet still, a question lingered, gnawing at the edges of reason. How had 3 women, 3 sisters, managed to carry on this cycle for years without intervention? Were they truly acting alone, or was there someone, something, protecting them? The crowd outside the courthouse began to chant for execution, but among the murmurs, there were also whispers that death might not be punishment enough, that if the sisters had indeed bound themselves to forces older than Scripture, a noose or a cell might only release them to something worse. The horror of Blackthorn House was no longer confined to whispers. It was manifest in every shattered wall, every blood-stained brick, every breathless silence that fell over its rotting halls. By the late 19th century, investigators who entered the house did not return with clarity, but with trembling hands, hollow eyes, and an unshakable impression that the house itself was alive. They reported hearing children weeping in the cellar, their cries mingling with the sound of chains dragging across stone floors. Yet when doors were forced open, there was nothing, only the damp echo of abandonment, as though the house mocked their efforts to expose it. And yet, diaries uncovered in a locked chest revealed far worse truths than rumors could ever suggest. These diaries, believed to belong to one of the Blackthorn sons, detailed how the family viewed themselves not as criminals, but as keepers of a necessary order. To them, the chained children were sacrifices of purity, required to maintain their power against the decay of mortality. Every year, a child was chosen for a ritual, their screams swallowed by the earth beneath the house. In exchange, the family claimed they were blessed with longevity, their influence stretching far beyond Ravenshade. Whether myth or fact, the townspeople could not ignore how the Blackthorn bloodline seemed to endure when others withered. The most chilling entry spoke of the basement door that never remained locked. It described a heavy oak barrier that, no matter how many bolts or chains were fastened, swung open during nights of ritual. The writer confessed that sometimes he heard knocking from the other side, as if something within the foundation wanted out. Not the children, but something older, darker, that the family had courted in exchange for their reign. By now, the house itself was no longer a place of residence, but a tomb. Each investigator that left swore they felt followed, as though the shadows of the chained children had fastened to their backs. A priest brought to exorcise the estate lasted only 3 nights before fleeing into the woods, muttering that the house does not want forgiveness. It wants more blood. This section of the story marks the shift from tragedy to an unspeakable horror, because what lived in the Blackthorn cellar may have been human once, but by the late 1800s, it had become something else, something the family had raised, nurtured, and perhaps unleashed upon Ravenshade itself. The story of the Renmore children did not end in the year 1873. It only began there. Their existence continues to ripple through time, like a wound that refuses to close. Every attempt by historians, scientists, or psychologists to explain them has failed. Records were destroyed, eyewitnesses silenced, and even the land itself seems cursed. Families who moved into the outskirts of Ravenshade reported hearing scratching beneath their floors, as if something was still chained in the earth. Others swore they saw pale figures wandering at night, their eyes too hollow, their movements too deliberate, like echoes of the children who were once confined. This is what unsettles people the most. The Renmore children were not just anomalies. They represented something bigger, a break in the natural order. It wasn't simply that they defied medical science. It was that they seemed untouched by human laws of time, growth, and decay. Some witnesses even described seeing them appear decades later, unchanged, lurking near rivers or graveyards, vanishing before being approached. Whether these were hallucinations, fabricated folklore, or something far more sinister remains uncertain. But the fact remains, Raven Shade is still whispered about in fear, and Elias Renmore's name lingers like an accusation against history itself. If these children were experiments, then the question becomes, whose experiment were they? Was Elias a puppet of something larger? Perhaps a hidden order, a cult, or an institution whose reach went beyond a single man? Or was he simply a father who opened a door he was never meant to touch? That question is what keeps this tale alive, long after the graves were dug and the doors of the farmhouse rotted away. And now, as we stand at the edge of this story, the choice is yours. Do you dismiss it as myth, as a grotesque exaggeration born of a superstitious century? Or do you dare to consider the possibility that somewhere, in the shadows of our world, the impossible still walks among us? The story of Elias Renmore is not finished. It lingers, waiting, feeding on curiosity. Because legends like these don't die, they spread. And now that you've heard it, Raven Shade belongs to you as well. The fog around Raven Shade never truly lifted, and perhaps it was never meant to. The macabre mystery of the Blackthorn family had ended, not with answers, but with silence. A silence that stretched far beyond the cellar walls where 47 children once clung to chains, beyond the cracked gravestones that bore no names, beyond the whispers of villagers too afraid to speak. The name Blackthorn was buried, yet it lingers, a curse carved not into stone, but into the very air of Raven Shade. Some say the land itself rejects any attempt at renewal. Farmers who tried to till the soil where the Blackthorn estate once stood reported that nothing would grow. Crops withered overnight, cattle refused to graze, and families who built homes there abandoned them within months, haunted by screams they swore were carried on the night winds. Others speak of children, always children, seen wandering near the ruins, pale, thin, and silent, vanishing when approached. The authorities of the time sealed the cellar, but villagers claim the chains remain, untouched, still cold to the hand, as if waiting for wrists to return. The legacy of the Blackthorns is not just a story of cruelty. It is a wound, one that time has not healed. Science could not explain the conditions of the children who were found, nor the resilience of their suffering. Historians could not agree on what truly happened in that House of Shadows. And the Church? The Church denied all involvement, though documents hidden in their archives whispered otherwise. Raven Shade was left to rot in mystery, as though the truth itself was too poisonous to bring into the light. Tonight, as you reflect on this tale, ask yourself, what makes a family like the Blackthorns possible? Was it madness, corruption, or something older, something darker, woven into the soil of Raven Shade itself? Evil does not vanish. It waits, it shifts, it takes new forms. Perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. The Blackthorns are not gone. They are merely sleeping, their curse alive in silence, in shadow, in memory. And so we close this chapter, but not the story. The land remembers. The chains remember. Raven Shade remembers. And perhaps, one night, when the fog is thick and the silence is heavy, the Blackthorns will return. This is DeadScroll. If this story has shaken you, do not let it fade into the night. Like, share, and subscribe. Darkness, after all, is only defeated when it is named. Until the next tale, beware the silence.